What if Black Sabbath went folk rock? This week we'll be discussing how the arrival of Ronnie James Dio helped Black Sabbath to reinvent and reinvigorate themselves after parting ways with one of the heavy metal genre's most recognisable and iconic vocalists. And we'll also be celebrating the British folk rock genre, an altogether more epic and esoteric form of folk rock than its transatlantic cousin. All that and more on this week's What If, How and Why. Hi, my name is Morgan Brown, and every Monday I upload a new What If video to my YouTube channel. Then on Wednesdays follow it with one of these companion videos where I discuss the artists and genres involved in the What If video, and also share a little bit of my creative process. The idea of the What Ifs is that each week I pick a popular song and imagine an alternative universe in which some change of circumstances causes that song to come out completely different from the version we know and love. Then take the original lead vocal of that song and record a new backing track to it using just GarageBand and whatever instruments I have around the house in order to bring that alternative version of the song to life. So the song I picked this week was The Mob Rules by Black Sabbath, and I tried to reimagine that as a UK folk rock style song. So if you haven't had a chance to listen to that yet, here's a little taster.
Close the city and tell the people that something's coming to call. Death and darkness are rushing forward to take a bite from the wall. You've nothing to say. They're breaking away. If you listen to fools, the mob rules. The mob.
Now, just before I start, I should mention that this week's What If was actually a request. Unfortunately, I didn't note down who the request came from, and I can't find the comment now where it was made, so I really apologise that I've forgotten your name, whoever it was, but hopefully you're seeing this and hopefully it lives up to your expectations. I just thought it was a really good idea, so thank you, whoever you were. Now, I've generally tried to avoid revisiting artists and genres too much on this channel, and I have done a Black Sabbath song before when I attempted to turn War Pigs into a big band jazz song, but I did just really like the idea that my commenter suggested, and I figured that 1980s Black Sabbath was sufficiently a different band from early 70s Aussie fronted Sabbath to make it okay. So kind of cheating, kind of going against my own rules, but I think it's probably okay. So I did talk about the Aussie era of Sabbath quite a bit in the companion video to that War Pigs version that I did. And obviously that initial version of the band was untouchable. They completely redefined heavy guitar music. Absolutely immaculate string of albums from the debut through to at least Sabotage. And Ozzy was absolutely the perfect frontman for that version of the band. Really unique voice, really unique stage presence. But by the time you get to the last couple of albums of that initial iteration of the band, you can tell things aren't quite going according to plan. There are obviously differences of opinion about where the band should be going. They're trying out different things. It's not all really clicking. All their various substance abuse problems were getting to an unmanageable level. Even though there's definitely some good stuff on both of those albums, you can tell that things aren't really functioning as they should be anymore. They did actually try to replace Ozzy after Technical Ecstasy, before the Never Say Die album. They did actually start recording without him, with Dave Walker on vocals, and Ozzy was kind of getting set to make a solo record but ended up coming back and making one more album with Sabbath, but it was still not working out. So they part ways, and although some bands managed to carry on pretty successfully after losing a singer, it can be the death knell. So there must have been people who were thinking there's no way Sabbath can possibly carry on without Ozzy. He was such a kind of focal point. And it's hard to think of too many people who could have stepped into that role, but as luck would have it, Tony Iommi happened to run into Ronnie James Dio, who, as luck would further have it, was looking for something to do, having just parted ways with Rainbow. And it was just a great pairing because Dio was obviously an absolutely amazing singer, great range, could certainly handle everything that Ozzy had done with the band. He could totally sing those songs, but at the same time it was very different, so there was no chance of what he came up with sounding like he was just trying to imitate Ozzy. It was always going to be its own thing, so it was really a perfect combination in a way. And Dio's such an interesting character. By the time he joined Sabbath, he was already a real veteran of the music industry, more so than the other members of Sabbath. He He made his recording debut way back in the early 60s. I think he actually started out playing in bands in the 50s. He was a bass player originally in a band called something like the Vegas Kings, I think. And eventually they must have realised that he was a better singer than the guy who was the actual lead singer. And he got promoted to lead vocals in time for their second single, making this very of the era doo-woppy R&B, which is very nice, but not really any kind of foreshadowing of the kind of music that he'd become famous for. Carried on playing music through the 60s, eventually starting a psychedelic band called, I think, the Electric Elves, which over the next few years gradually morphed into Elf, becoming a bit more of a straightforward hard rock band rather than the psychedelic group that they started out as. And Elf really was the band that gave him the step up to the next level, because they managed to form a pretty close friendship with Deep Purple and ended up supporting Deep Purple on a bunch of tours, which, you know, in itself would be a great leg up for any band, but which became even more of a leg up for him when Richie Blackmore decided he was leaving Purple and ended up essentially hiring pretty much all of Elf to be the initial lineup of Rainbow. And that's where Dio really comes into his own. Obviously, the combination of Blackmore's guitar and Dio's voice and lyrics take that Purple hard rock sound to the next level and push it more towards what heavy metal becomes. Fantasy-inspired lyrics, the vocal acrobatics, the big, powerful, inspiring themes that certainly particularly the power metal genre still to this day is totally built on. So finally, after probably a decade and a half in the business, that's the band that really put him on the map. So it was a big name in heavy rock by the time he came to join Sabbath. There must have been some question about how he would fit into the band because, as I say, although his work with Rainbow definitely helped to evolve one strand of metal, it's a very different approach to Sabbath. Sabbath obviously being pretty relentlessly dark and gloomy and negative in a lot of their stuff, and Dio's work with Rainbow, as I say, being quite inspiring a lot of the time, that sort of uplifting proto-power metal feel. But there was obviously just a really effective chemistry between him and Geezer Butler and Tony Iommi, which produced some fantastic songs. I think it was a very different way of working for Black Sabbath. Ozzy had always taken a bit of a backseat songwriting-wise, with Geezer providing the lion's share of the lyrics, and that was not going to happen with Ronnie James Dio. He really wanted these to be his own words, so that changed. And the way he interacts with the riffs that Tony Iommi comes up with is really different too. You listen to a lot of those classic Sabbath records, Ozzy's vocals tend to kind of really lock in with the riff, and it's almost like the vocal is an extension of the riff quite a lot of the time. Think things like Iron Man or Sweet Leaf. There's a very close relationship between the riff and the vocal line, whereas Dio takes a completely different approach where the riff's the foundation, but then the vocal kind of rides across it. It'll have its own melody, it'll have its own rhythm, and that completely changes the way the band sounds. So the new stuff is quite unrecognisable in a way, even though it still has some elements that have carried over from the classic original Sabbath lineup. In some respects, I guess you can say they moved towards a more sort of stereotypical heavy metal sound of the era, but that was probably a necessary move as well. I think those last couple of Ozzy era albums had kind of muddied the waters of the Sabbath sound. They'd lost a bit of focus, and in the meantime a bunch of hungry new metal bands had been emerging. You know, you've got Iron Maiden coming up at the time, Judas Priest had really hit their stride by this point, and they were in danger of being left behind, and those Dio albums really make a powerful statement that Sabbath is the metal band. They're the band to set the standard. So it worked really well for just a couple of years there, but then obviously, as I say, the creative balance in the band had shifted a bit and there was some discomfort about that. I think that kind of started to come to the head, particularly in the mixing of the Live Evil album, where Dio was convinced that his vocals were being dropped down in the mix, and then Iommi was saying that he'd heard from the engineers that after they finished the day's mixing session, Dio was coming back in and changing the mixes again to push his voice back up. Just really kind of petty stuff, but it was enough to cause a split in the band and years of turmoil following Black Sabbath as they go through different successive lineups. Dio and Vinny Appice split off to form the band Dio and carry on making some great stuff with that. That lineup of the band did reunite in the early 90s for the Dehumanizer album, which wasn't particularly well received at the time, I seem to recall. In retrospect, pretty solid record. Again, still plenty of tensions there, so that didn't last again, and Sabbath continued with one of their assorted other lineups for a few years. but then as a happy ending to that version of the band, they did manage to reunite again after the classic lineup members had managed to bury the hatchet and they'd reunited with Ozzy. The early 80s lineup also got back together under the name Heaven and Hell to avoid confusion with the still active Ozzy version, all older and wiser and with their egos a little bit more in check, and made another very good album under that name too. Obviously, as we know, Ronnie passed away in 2010, but I think it's really, really nice that after a few years of playing and recording to dwindling returns, it was really great that he got to have that proper moment back in the spotlight with a really massive band, and well deserved, because what an absolute legend. While I'll always be mainly a booster for the original Ozzy era of Black Sabbath, it's pretty impressive that Dio managed to help them to create the second coming for the band that was almost as powerful and iconic as that genre-defining initial run. But yeah, while Black Sabbath were taking one strand of British guitar rock in ever darker and heavier directions back at the turn of the 60s into the 70s, another wave of musicians were taking it in an altogether different direction. The British folk rock scene is a really interesting thing. Obviously, the British Isles have a very long tradition of folk song, several different traditions in fact, obviously with England and Ireland and Wales and Scotland all having their own separate traditions that overlap in various places. And there'd been a folk revival movement in the UK for some years by the late 60s. There were elements of it that slightly edged into pop music, particularly with groups like the Seekers, who definitely came from that kind of folk revival background but nudged their way into the pop charts, but hadn't really particularly found its way into rock music as such in the same way that American folk music did. I guess obviously Dylan going electric in the mid-60s was the catalyst for that, and then you get the whole wave of bands following his example, obviously with the likes of the Byrds leading the charge, not only electrifying Dylan songs but also casting back into the back catalogues of the likes of Pete Seeger and Woody Guthrie and further back to more traditional material as well. So America has that thriving kind of folk rock scene from the mid-60s, which starts to then influence the UK scene, with a lot of established bands kind of touching on that sound, and then a whole new wave of bands emerging who are very directly influenced by that. And Fairport Convention absolutely started out as a band who were totally in thrall of that US folk rock scene. You listen to their debut album, the self-titled one, it's pretty much entirely drawing from US influences. There's Dylan songs, Joni Mitchell songs, but they're really clearly plugged into that US folk and singer-songwriter scene. But then it's really interesting to follow them along over the next few albums, because you see this gradual change taking place as the members of the band, especially Ashley Hutchings, the original bass player, start to think, we're playing this American folk music, but there's plenty of folk music right here in the UK too. I wonder if there's some of that we can incorporate in the same way that these American bands are incorporating their folk songs. So over the next few records, you do start to see just more hints of folk sounds from the British Isles creeping in alongside the Dylan covers and the like that are still there too. I think the big turning point for them comes on the Unhalf Bricking album, where one of the centerpieces of the album is a folk rock arrangement of the traditional song A Sailor's Life, and to make it sound more authentically folky, they recruit renowned folk fiddle player Dave Swarbrick, and this meeting of Dave Swarbrick and Fairport Convention is the thing that finally totally solidifies that British folk rock sound. Swarbrick but really sparks a proper hardcore interest in British folk song in the band, and Ashley Hutchings really starts seriously researching these songs, and at the same time the band inspires Dave Swarbrick. He starts to really realise the potential of combining this traditional music with this electric power. So by their next album, Legion Leaf, he's become a full-time presence in the band, and the American influence has been pretty much completely supplanted by a big swathe of traditional songs and traditional influences, and that really crystallises that British folk rock sound. I should say this isn't all happening in a vacuum. They're not the only group that's sort of moving in this direction at the same time that they're going through this process. You have Steel Eye Span coming up, the Straubs, both of whom arrive at their own unique versions of the British folk rock sound. Pentangle, who come from more of a kind of acoustic folk jazz background, then gradually working more electric stuff into the sound and bringing slightly more of a rock influence too. So by the time the 70s rolled round, there's a whole movement of these bands who are all finding their own ways to combine traditional folk songs and original compositions written in the style of traditional folk songs with rock rock in a way that's completely different and distinct from the US folk rock sound that's already been well known for a few years. I find a lot of those records stand up really well to this day. For me, they managed to escape quite a lot of the pitfalls and the cliches that quite quickly set in a lot of other rock music of the era. These mad historical tales and murder ballads, sometimes really dark, sometimes really funny. It's nice to hear British 70s rock singers who aren't singing in some ridiculous American accent. It's nice hearing 70s rock guitarists who aren't just Eric Claptoning all over a blues scale. Obviously the peak of it couldn't last. By the latter half of the 70s, as punk came in, a lot of this stuff, I think it was kind of felt to be something of a relic of that hippie era, and in the snotty, fast-paced world of punk seemed powerfully uncool. But a lot of people just stuck with it, and in one form or another, the music survived. The influence of those bands has been picked up by successive generations of musicians, and a few of the originators are still plugging away too. It's a few years now since I saw Fairport, but they were just phenomenal, absolutely great. It's so cool that it's still possible to go and see these amazing musicians playing this completely timeless music. Oh yeah, anyway, that takes me up to this week's alternative universe scenario. So in my alternate timeline this week, it's 1979. Sabbath have parted ways with Ozzy, and they're trying to figure out what they're going to do, because obviously it's a pretty tall order replacing such an iconic frontman. But then, fortunately, Tony Iommi happens to run into Ronnie James, who, as luck would have it, is also looking for a new gig. Iommi is delighted to see him. He says, do you want to just come along to a rehearsal, sing some songs, see how you fit in? If it all works out, then the gig's yours. And Dio's very excited. He thinks, oh, this is it, I've got the gig. So goes along to a rehearsal. But the moment he walks into the rehearsal room, he senses that this is a very different band to the Black Sabbath that he thought he knew, because in addition to the normal members of the band, there's also Dave Swarbrick and Dave Pegg from Fairport Convention, who've been brought along to fill in on violin and mandolin respectively. Tony Iommi cheerfully explains that while the band's been on a break after Ozzy's left, he's been getting really into traditional folk song, and he's convinced that the future of Black Sabbath lies in moving in a much more folky direction. And poor old Ronnie James is a little bit perturbed by this. It wasn't what he thought he was signing up for, but thinks, well, a gig's a gig, so dive straight in, and finds that actually it works surprisingly well. And within a pretty short time, they've crafted this whole new set of songs that take the intricacy and mystery of traditional British folk, but combine it with the sort of raw, strident power of Ronnie James Dio's voice. And they're really proud of this new sound and take it out on the road. And it doesn't meet with the commercial success that the previous iteration of Black Sabbath did, but fortunately they're welcomed with open arms by the hardcore members of the folk rock community, whose support sustains them through the years. And they go on to co-headline Cropperty Festival on many occasions along with Fairport. So, in attempting to turn the Mob Rules into a vaguely Fairport Convention style British folk rock track, the first step as ever was just getting the isolated vocal, dropping it into GarageBand and syncing up to the grid. With that done, I think I tweaked the tempo a little bit. It's a pretty hard driving song originally. I wanted a slightly more steady pace. And then next thing was just to pop some drums on there. I wanted to use the feel of Fairport's version of Matty Groves as a bit of a template. So listen to what Dave Maddox did on that original recording and tried to do something a little bit similar, because he's really, for me, the definitive British folk rock drummer. Pretty steady with just a nice little bit of swing to it and a few tasty fills here and there. Added some bass next. A temptation, I think, if you're going for more of a folk song, is to just fall into the sort of root and fifth kind of dum 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 stuff that you might hear in a more traditional folk arrangement. But listening to those old Fairport records, Dave Pegg, although he came from a traditional folk background, he was in the Ian MacDonald folk group before he joined Fairport. Once he joined Fairport, he was like, well, I'm in a rock band now. So he doesn't tend to fall into that too much. He plays some pretty rocking stuff, so tried to strike a balance between some bits that reinforce the folkiness, but some bits that are pretty much straight ahead 70s rock, with a reasonably forceful kind of rocking tone as well. Next thing was guitars. There's a pair of guitars on there. Again, thinking of that classic Fairport lineup, I was thinking of Simon Nicol and Richard Thompson's respective roles in the band. So Simon Nicol, when he was in that rhythm role, really kind of stuck to a proper rhythm role, steady in the pocket, rhythm guitar, just playing the chords, good dynamics. So that's what I tried to do on that one guitar. Fairly clean sound. The other one, I certainly can't play anything like Richard Thompson, but I wanted it to have a bit of that effect. So slightly pokier sound with a bit more gain, improvising bits of lead around the vocal, and also doubling up the fiddle melody that comes around, which has a little bit of a traditional real feel to it, and trying to avoid too much in the way of blues cliches as well, sticking to a bit more of a modal feel where I could. And then next I figured I needed some actual folk instrumentation. Obviously, if we're thinking about Fairport, one of the defining things of a lot of their classic stuff is the fiddle playing, mainly of Dave Swarbrick on those 70s records. I can't play the violin, but I turned to my trusty folk fiddle sound, which actually isn't a violin at all. On GarageBand, it's the Eru, I think is a Chinese bowed instrument, but it has a much more immediate raw attack than any of the violin sounds I've got, so use that. As I say, instead of the guitar riff of the original song, I came up with a traditional jig-sounding fiddle part, which crops up round and round again in between verses. And then I also just made up a couple of little solos for that fiddle to play as well. There's a couple of tracks on there of that because for some reason that sounds monophonic on GarageBand, so you can't play more than one note at once. And I wanted some kind of folky double stops, so I've got 2 tracks there to just do a bit of that as well. And to further the more authentic folk sound, I figured I'd also throw some mandolin on there. So that's mainly doubling that fiddle part that is also doubled by the lead guitar. But it has a little solo towards the end. Not a very good solo because I'm quite out of practice on the mandolin, but I thought we'd throw a bit of that into just to have a few of the instruments trading off solos towards the end of the song. And then for the video, as usual, started out by finding some footage of the Dio lineup of Black Sabbath playing the song. I think it's actually from the 90s reunion rather than the 80s, but I figured it wouldn't matter too much. So synced that up to the track. And then I wanted some instruments to make it look more authentically like a folk rock band. So found some footage of Fairport Convention, mostly from, I think it's a 1970-ish concert on Ainsdale Beach of all places. So we've got some good clips of Swarbrick playing the fiddle on there and some bits of Simon Nichols guitar, so it looks like we've got a second guitar there playing the rhythm. I also needed a mandolin, so I've got some later footage with Dave Pegg playing the mandolin to just have that instrument in there too. And then just as a final touch, I thought it'd be nice to have the Mob Rules era Sabbath logo just cropping up on a few folk rock bills to show that, you know, they're involved in that scene. So did a bit of my very clunky amateur photoscaping to edit them onto a few lineups of folk rock bands as well. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this one. It's a sound that I've wanted to have a go at for ages, so I was really grateful to have a suggestion of a song that I thought would work really well in that. And I don't mind revisiting Black Sabbath, particularly because it's such a different lineup of the band. It doesn't feel too much like cheating to me. So I really enjoyed doing this one. If you did enjoy it, if you want to leave me a comment, that would be lovely. And if you could like, share, subscribe, all that stuff really helps the channel and would make me very grateful. If there's anything else you'd like me to do in coming weeks and months, any artists or songs or genres you'd like me to check out, do let me know. Your suggestions are always extremely helpful. Otherwise, that's all from me for this week. So thanks very much indeed for watching, and I will hope to see you next time.